They say we should have known better than to fall so deep down into this rabbit hole we found. And I was thinking,
hi, this is Nico. You're listening to my dad Rafal, also known as the White Rabbit, and James Jardine on the one and only Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Buckle up and enjoy.
deep into this pool of regrettable situations. Pitch black, think back to the last time that we were happy.
And that is a tune you cannot help but just kind of bop along with. All right, good morning, and good afternoon, good evening. Welcome down the security rabbit hole. Welcome to your favorite cybersecurity podcast for news, information, personalities, and the kind of stories you don't get anywhere else. So this is going to be another great one, I hope. It's a topic we've talked to a little bit. We're talking about supply chain. We'll take a software angle from it. But before we do that, let's go around the horn here. We're going to start, as we do always, recurring permanent guest host, Mr. Jim Tiller below me. Hey, Jim.
Hey, how's it going? It's going good here. Finally, the sun is out. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I have so many questions around this area, so it's going to be exciting.
I have more questions than I have answers.
Yeah.
And then we'll go to the man that's probably going to have the most questions. James, good morning to you, sir.
Yeah, it's looking like this is going to be a pretty interesting episode. So I'm looking forward to hearing the information. You know, we talk supply chain a lot, but rarely is it, I think, more on the software side. So this will be interesting to see.
Well, and then our special guest, Mr. Tim Miller, who joins us. Tim, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are and what you do.
How you doing? So I'm calling in from middle of the woods, Connecticut. We do not have the sun out super well today here. It's kind of depressing, actually. But I'm a CEO of Kusari Inc. It's a software supply chain security company. But I spent my time working in large companies like Bridgewater Associates. Those are for 12 years. Mitsubishi Union Financial Group and Citi. And so software supply chain is basically just how we've been managing things securely on the dev side for a long time. And the names change over the years, but we've been doing it for a while. So I'm excited to chat about it. I also have tons of questions, so it's
good.
all around.
More guys with questions.
Point them to Jim.
What could possibly go wrong? All right, so I'm going to start it with this. Early 2000s, I worked for GE Power, and we built a software security program. And one of the things I noticed is about 80% of our developers couldn't quite tell you what was in what components that were reused from other open source or otherwise in their code, which scared the bejesus out of me. And that was before we had any real good static code analysis tools. Fast forward, I don't imagine that's any easier today. Now, there's plenty of tools that I've seen that are out there that will tell you, what components you have, which ones are vulnerable, blah, blah, blah. I've seen various conversations about how relevant these things are, but let's start with every company, almost every company, and every digital company has developers makes some sort of software for themselves, right? You're talking about hedge funds, like those are these algorithmic traders. The software, the algorithm is the intellectual property of the organization. This is how they make money, the microsecond faster than their competitors, all that stuff. How does the concept of software supply chain fit into that space?
Pretty squarely. So if you imagine you're in a hedge fund, and again, the software that you're writing, like you mentioned, is the intellectual property of the firm. It's no longer just a little thing that you're shipping from left to right. You're constantly making sure that has no exfiltration risk around it whatsoever. You're making sure that has no license issues with it whatsoever, like Trojan source licenses, none of that. So everything that's approaching that code to where it gets more and more real is something that you have to be more and more confident in. So the closer you get to actually pushing something out, especially when you match it up with the data, like you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of risk there. So that approach to making sure that I know what I'm putting there in every single step and who's going to manage it and what happens if there's going to be an issue is really, I think, the gist of software supply chain security. And really it boils down to kind of what you hinted at, is that most folks don't know what 85% of that stuff that they pulled down is. So you really got to get your head around it. It takes a slightly different approach to being able to get your head around that.
Tim, what the hell is an Trojan source license?
So yeah, there's a couple.
I think everybody was thinking that.
Yeah, so pulling in certain licenses will force the code that you're distributing to also be open source, and in a you can see pretty quickly why that's not cool. But that's just one example of all sorts of issues that you can deal with. But then I think this whole problem gets exacerbated because I think we've all been in dev environments, and no two dev environments work the same. Half the time there's some internal repository that's capturing a lot of the binaries that you're pulling down, either for quickness reasons to make sure that the internet's not going to go down, to backups to make sure that maybe you made a change to it and you don't know. But suddenly this problem gets really difficult when you have to pinpoint the thing that actually needs to get propagated out into all your stuff. So it's really a frustratingly difficult exercise for a lot of people.
And it's not just limited, like we use the hedge fund example when you think about typical like development groups within the org, but think about all the places now they're doing data science, that are doing all these different things where people are doing scripting, right? They're pulling in Rust, they're pulling in Python, they're pulling in all these different pieces that are typically outside the purview of a lot of the common like AppSec programs, right? Like we focus on the, oh, you build our apps for us, but we don't focus on the people that are working directly with our biggest data sources, and if they're doing Python, they're pulling in PyPy packages and all kinds of stuff that are commonly targeted, so it's not just the, oh, I'm the developer at the company. It's anybody that's loading any type of source.
Yeah, it's a very funny setup, and you see a lot of like weird micro distinctions around if scripts are considered source code or not, and categorizing those things differently, and then having different pipelines with different requirements on them. And I mean, this is where the problem gets like practically kind of silly, but it really is a real problem. This is a mess, and like, how do you know that the script didn't inject something in there or pull in something? That's where things start to explode, and then usually the bigger the company gets, the more of those you have.
As somebody that lives that was software security curious from a security perspective for many years, right? I lived in that world for 6-7 years nonstop. But I'm certainly not a developer, nor would anybody ever want me to be writing source code. But I do I do think about like one of the, when these issues come up is, okay, you're calling a library that does something you don't want to rewrite, right? Some method, some pull, some algorithm, something you don't want to have to rewrite.
Some left function.
Yeah, something. And that library might pull in another library or another set of libraries, which might also pull in some libraries. And like, where do the turtles stop?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a great answer for where the turtles stop, to be honest. They keep going. I guess that's like the turtle rabbit hole that they keep going down.
It's the turtles all the way down, right?
Yeah. But no, I think like what we tended to focus on, or we're like the bottom turtle that you'd call it, is the one that you can actually do something about. And then all the other ones are informational. They're still good to know because you can know if you have control over them or not. So like as an example, if log4j flowed in through Spring or something like that, and that's the one that you were using, Spring is the one that you're focusing on. That's the big thing. And so from your perspective, that's where the turtle would stop. And then you find those big ones, and then find where else they're used, and then you kind of turn the problem upside down, and then your focus areas on what to keep up to date, or where you have to amend or fork or whatever you got to do. But generally, tracing things all the way down to things that you can't actually control is informational. You can't magically patch it. You're likely not going to go upstream to some random library you never use, submit a pull request, have that flow through down all the way, and then magically pop up in your environment later that same day. It's just not practical.
I think for me, where I struggle is I'm coming at it from, say, maybe like the CISO position, for example, right? And it's always good to know what's out there, what's happening. But at the same time, I have this weird sense that you're shining a light in a particular direction, but it's not lighting all the corners. And there's no hope of ever seeing the dark corners. And so it's almost creates an additional set of problems that you can't even have an opportunity to solve. So are you seeing this more being used from a forensic perspective? Like, okay, something went sideways, let's go look at this information to figure out what it is? Or are you seeing it more as merging into being proactive? I'm trying to figure out what side of the coin this is on.
Yeah, so frankly, both, but right now, I think today it's more reactive and more forensics driven. So like, put yourself in the first 10 minutes of the next incident. Like, what are you doing with these things you're looking, right?
Please don't do that. Bring the nightmares.
Sorry, it's creative PTSD for everybody. No, but you're looking for stuff, right? You're going to find it. You're going to see where it is. You're going to go to you're going to figure where all this is at, where all this is at. And likely many people are doing that same activity at the same time. And then lining that up with this chasm between whatever team gave them the, hey, you have an issue, and the team that can do something about it. And so right now, the big value add is in forensics. But being proactive, you do the same thing just before there's an issue. So that's the goal today, more forensic and reactive, which is where most folks struggle, by the way. I think that's where like things like Log4j effectively are like endemic now, that they're just stuck in certain environments, and they're really hard to pull out. And for not great reason, just like this is just a really complex web, and there's too much of them. And so, yeah,
a real quick follow-up question on that would be is, do you think the barrier between forensics and proactive, reactive versus proactive, and moving in that trajectory, do you think that's like the challenge is keeping it updated? That's the other big question I have, is you can follow these chains, but to like Raf's point, you have, you know, an include from a whatever, and then the one the furthest down changes. And how do you, it's one thing to identify it, one thing to identify a change.
Yeah, I think it can be. I think if you are operating the way the large majority of tools do, which is usually either at what I call the right side of the dev cycle, so like in CI/CD scans or artifact scans, or even an artifact repository after it's been published, taking that and then basically undoing all the compilation where everything came from and tracing it back to the source, I think can be a very difficult thing to do. If you can keep track of it from beginning to end, it's suddenly not that difficult. I'm not trying to claim that that's easy, but that's a different approach to keeping track. That's more just provenance of everything, as opposed to, oh, I found a thing and then run some magic and try to figure out where it came from. A lot of the magic is going to be right, but it's not going to give you that blast radius. It'll tell you where that thing in, like, you know, that issue in your current package is. But you probably got hundreds, if not thousands, of packages with that same issue. And how do you fix those two? Is there one step that you can take? Is there two step, like that path from, okay, I found it, and now what, is where that lack of that information gap really starts to get in your face. Not impossible, but yeah.
I think the challenge we see too, especially when we talk about supply chain, is everything is after the fact as far as knowing it, right? Like, you've been using that component for years, and it wasn't until yesterday that somebody identified a vulnerability with it. Or I don't want to say yesterday they identified it, somebody actually shared that it's been identified, right? I mean, they could have known that vulnerability there was years, and hey, I'm just going to keep that in my back pocket. We have no idea, because everything we do from a vulnerability standpoint with third-party components, right, is all reactive of, oh, somebody just announced that there's a vulnerability. Hey, am I using that component? Let me go update it. You know, so I think from that standpoint too, there's a big challenge of, it's already out there vulnerable. It's not like you wrote it. It's just nobody's found it yet.
Yeah, I think that point is a really good one too. Like, the things are already there, and so your job now is to fix it as fast as possible, and your job is not to fix the one thing, but to make sure that entire class of issue has been remediated. Again, usually you're going to have that issue in more than one package, more than one deployment, more than one artifact, and so now your job is to tactically make that fix as quickly as possible. And pushing all that stuff to the end really makes that effectively whack-a-mole, right? Like, you're waiting for it all to turn blue or green, depending on on how old your Jenkins colors are. And that's just not an appropriate way to attack that problem. It's too late, or too slow in most cases.
Are you seeing any places that, because I mean, it's easy to say, hey, look, if you're doing a release, everything should be updated, right? Like you're on the latest version of everything. Every release you do, you make sure on your latest version. But that's not as easily done as it is said, right? Are there places that are doing that? And even if you do it, hey, I've got everything up to date, it still doesn't mean that tomorrow a vulnerability is not found in that package and I don't release for another month.
Yeah, so I think that the issue is that, like, while no, I don't think anyone's ever going to say don't update things as aggressively as possible. You want to do that as for lots of obvious reasons, but I think this is where a lot of the security tooling folks kind of lose empathy for how the dev cycle works in real life, right? You can't just update everything all the time and call that the model. In reality, a lot of times they don't have control to pull those things down. They have to get approval for it in a lot of cases, especially in regulated environments. It's not a thing they can just go do quickly. So is there another path that they can take? This is like, where is that thing coming from? Is there another spot to switch it up? Like, is there an alternative to patching it for these folks who can't necessarily pull it down? And their ability to push things through those cycles is also really difficult, probably partly because of this problem. Those processes tend to be riddled with bureaucracy to make sure that they know who they can blame when it's going through the process, so that when something pops up, they can just think, oh, it was Tim, he messed up.
Can I take the practical view on this for a second? I know it's going to be unlike me for a moment, but having lived through the being the guy that would say, hey, you've got a bunch of stuff here, fix this. There are lots of cases where you have a piece of software that is updating, a big piece of software, building block components down here, open source all over, reused includes whatever. They're updating this little tiny chunk here. Okay, they updated I don't know, the color on a dashboard on one of their, they call them portlets, and little pieces on the thing. Okay, great. It goes through the process. We run all these things on there. Like, holy cow, you're using this old vulnerable include down here. This is critical. It'll nuke the entire thing. It'll subject it to an RCE flaw type of issue, right? You'll be able to take over the entire thing, steal all the data. And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. We updated this. Like, this isn't me. This is like, that's how typically, at least when you're outsourcing it, how corporate software development is done, right? They get this tiny little micro bubble here. They work on it. They spit it out. Nobody like, oh, well, the other 98% isn't us. From a practical perspective, like, how the hell do you deal with that? Because I spent 2.5 years trying to deal with that. And the only way that ever even came remotely close to working, and I'll use working in air quotes because, I mean, it was functional. It wasn't good, but it was functional in that, okay, the next time that, because I go back and tell them, hey, you have to update this. Go, we don't have the budget for that. We didn't budget for that. We only budgeted for changing the colors out. We didn't budget for stripping out updating the Spring framework underneath. Like, well, we'll do that on the next release. You're like, okay, when is that? They're like, about 9 months. Like, what's a better answer to that?
Well, I mean, I think the first problem is making sure that you're able to answer that is actually a problem. So there's first, like, hey, we actually do have this issue, and it's not something that's just budget related. There really is, like, I don't know, 90 versions of that little thing that you're dealing with, and they maybe updated one, but they left the other 89 because those are out of budget or out of scope, or maybe somebody else's responsibility. So we always hold this problem similar to how you would diagnose anything. Like, first is you kind of get your head around what's actually happening right now. Like, what are the facts on the ground? And this is part of the facts on the ground. What are the things in your environment? Where did they come from? Who put them there? Why? What's going on with them? And where are they going? And then from there, a lot of these you can start to make some incremental decisions. So you don't have to jump from hey, I've got no budget to fix anything for 9 months, to, hey, there's a very clear opportunity to squish these two things together. And now we only have, maybe cut the footprint in half. And so you can start to work iteratively once you see that big graph. So that's the approach we've always taken, but it does require that a fairly big upfront cost of getting all that data. But I mean, you also see folks do things like, I mean, frankly, put crappy paperwork processes in front of that problem. Like you can't pull down a version unless it's the approved one from our internal gated repository, which a separate team deals with. You need tickets to go into it. There's other ways to solve that problem. That the paperwork one is not one I would recommend, but it's definitely one that a lot of folks do out of being more practically actionable for them.
I want to ask the question that's been sitting in the back of my head. I'm terrified to ask this question all the time because I know what the answer is in real life, and that is the technical debt question. Right? You've got the average company. Okay, they've not thought about this. Somebody says this is a must. They go, great, let's do it. I'm implementing it tomorrow. They buy the tool. They start scanning the repositories. They start implementing this, and they go, oh my god, everything is broken. It all needs to be gutted. What the hell? What do we do now? By the way, they still have to have. There's still a pipeline that's happening right now, and there's still planning going on for stuff that's going out later this quarter. What's your advice on addressing that? Because that's the part I've never. I mean, yes, the standard. We need to whittle that down as best as we can. Blah blah blah. Like, but how? How do you do that?
Yeah. So what we tend to recommend is, again, if you kind of step back for a minute, the problems that technical debt would cause you are going to be things like slow release cycles, more expensive patching, longer testing cycles, or difficult installations, things of that nature. It will pop up somehow in a practical issue that's not just tech debt as a thing. And so what we would tend to say is, like, find your most critical app that you're struggling with and work backwards from there. What about that one in this tree is actually causing you the issues? And then are there any other implications of that? And then you can start to get the real attack path for which ones are both practically affecting you and also are going to incidentally clean up other things in the path. So then you work backwards, and eventually what you find is that a lot of stuff you can just get rid of entirely, which before you weren't sure because you didn't know if it did anything or not, and there was no answer. But starting back, going back to what am I actually doing, and why is it hard? Using that information to make that easier, then you can kind of walk backwards, find those big hit items, and then get a couple of leaps forward, and then do that until you feel good about it, which is basically forever.
James, you're living this. Does that work? I mean, is that how did you guys tackle this? Are you guys working? I mean, as a software shop, how do you think about it? Does that sound right?
I mean, a lot of what we look at, really, I mean, especially when we're looking at third-party components, if we're just talking vulnerability standpoint, like, hey, this is a vulnerable component, is it actually something that's even exploitable, right? Is this something that's out there? A lot of that stuff doesn't hit my radar unless it's actually newsworthy. So unless you're talking about a Log4Shell, if you're seeing something that's really making buzz across the social media platforms, like, hey, this is being attacked, that makes it, right? A lot of the other stuff, we look at it, if it's something that's going to give some sort of RCE or something that we think, hey, wow, this is something that we really need to pay attention to. But, SCA, when you look at that stuff, is oftentimes worse than static analysis as far as number of findings that pop out. Static analysis, we're like, oh, I got 20,000 findings. I do SCA and I get 100,000 things because I've got 1,000 repos that are all built on the same technology. .NET's a great example, right? Hey, I've got 100 apps that all run .NET, and system.text.encoding comes out with a vulnerability, and now I've got 100 vulnerabilities sitting out there because every app uses that. But 0 of those apps are actually vulnerable to that vulnerability. So being able to understand the technology stacks that you're using and, hey, where does this really fit in my app? I think that's where it is, right? It's going back to that exploitability. Is what are my critical apps? I'm more concerned about the one that's public facing that has all the sensitive data than I am some internal app that 3 people use, on our site. Like trying to break it down like that. But if you're trying to boil the ocean with these type of things, it's really difficult, and you spend a lot of time chasing down things that are really just nothing, right? I mean, yeah, okay, it's a vulnerability, but I think there's been reports that come out about how many are actually exploitable with SCA tools, and I think it's a low percentage that are actually findable. Contrast does it; they'll come out with, some reports that indicate, like 10% or something like that of the findings that are out there through those are actually reachable in the majority of code bases.
So then how do you trust that output? How do you make those decisions? Tim, James, how do you make those decisions? Do you do them all by hand? That doesn't seem practical. Are there families of tech, not to call any particular product, are there families of tech that are better than any others? Are there groups, or is this all just like hope and a prayer?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, where I am, we're pretty much 100% a single type of development platform. So
okay.
We're not across
Fair
the
enough.
board with all kinds of things. Like I said, you got people that are doing scripting with Python. You've got people that are doing other things. But even those, I think, have very common characteristics, right? Like the issues you see with Python packages are usually more of somebody put up a malicious version and they're trying to steal your crypto wallet. Less so are you seeing hey, it's vulnerable to SQL injection and now I'm being, taken over or something. So I think that plays a part too of what language are we dealing with? What package system are we dealing with? What are the typical issues we see with those? But yeah, I mean, it's just really just kind of, a lot of it is manual. I mean, if you've got a great system that can dig down and show you the graphing and show you all the different stuff and say, hey, we can map this out to quickly identify what's exploitable, what's not exploitable, that type of stuff, that's super helpful. But I think at the end, it whittles it down to enough that a manual review usually is what happens to be able to end it, unless you want to like really overwhelm the dev team with a ton of tickets and say, hey, we've got all this stuff you need to go deal with. And the tech debt thing is interesting because when you talk about some of these things, I'll use jQuery as an example, right? Like, hey, I don't update jQuery for 5 years. Updating jQuery from 1.8 to 18.8 doesn't happen, right? Like that's a complete rewrite of your application versus a team that actually like keeps their systems updated. But the problem is, right, is that once we finish an app, I call it finish. Once we're kind of done with active development, it goes into maintenance mode. It's don't fix it unless it's broke.
Yeah.
Right. So it sits out there stagnant. It's working. And then you find out, oh, wait, this has this major vulnerability. We got to update. Oh, I can't update that because it breaks the entire application. Going back to your comment about I work in a micro bubble.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, yeah. I mean, going from .1.1.1 to 1.1.2 probably is not going to break anything. We could push that. But going from 1 to 2, we just broke half the app. Like now it's a project. How do we get to this next level of these components?
Tim, how did you do that? Like, how does that work? And when you've got, I mean, look, I think it's easier in a world where the app is never done, right? Like you're talking about, it's continuously worked on. It's always updated. It's always tweaked. It's always tested. But I would say, I would venture to say 70% maybe of the environments where the app is done, released, and it goes into maintenance mode. There's nobody looking at it every day to go, oh, hey, this has got a new vuln. The disparity between these two worlds is drastic. Any thoughts on that?
So that's why we kind of moved away from relying exclusively on the CI/CD based scanning. Because again, if you're not running a build, to your point, if your thing is effectively just in maintenance mode, a lot of the time those things might not even run through a pipeline for months, if not a year, sometimes longer. And so you literally don't even get the signal. And so finding some way to extract it, and folks do this in various different ways, but pulling that information out of that so you have that adjacent to your CI/CD system, so that you can basically feed that data back in and know should you trigger something, is the approach that we took. Because again, to your point, a lot of those things that are sitting there are not useless; they're just not actively being worked on. Most of those things have kind of gotten stable and are just sitting there, and they do their thing. But yeah, that's where a lot of the problems lie. That was our approach when we did that at the hedge funds, was pull the data out and effectively maintain really like a manifest on the side. You'd probably call it an SBOM today, but like like a manifest of everything that was in there, and some different information about it, and then use that to feed the vulnerability reports, or marry up with the vulnerability reports.
There's definitely options to not do it just through CI/CD. Like we run Python scripts nightly that go in and check every repo and pull a bomb from it and import it to be able to interrogate every repo is done at least on a weekly basis to keep up with that type of stuff. So it's an interesting challenge, right? Because these apps that sit out there, not only, oh, hey, we did find something and it is vulnerable. Say we did find out, like, yep, this is exactly vulnerable, what we're talking about. We need to fix this. It's not actively maintained. So now you're pulling somebody off of another project to be able to swing back over to this other one, and who knows how long it's been going, right? Like, or how long it's been sitting there. And it's like, okay, now I got to figure out, do I even have an ID that opens this thing? I mean, it's sad to say, but this happens. I mean, I remember years ago, like way long time ago when beta.net was out. I mean, I worked for a company, they wrote an app in the .NET beta. And then later on, they were like, hey, we need to fix something. I mean, you couldn't even open this thing. I mean, it was ridiculous to try to pull it into an actual production release. And the number of vulnerabilities, like the same type of situation, you're caught on such an old system that when it finally comes around time, it's not a, oh yeah, this is a 2-day project. It's a, hey, this is like a 6-month project for us to be able to update this. So it gets really challenging.
Yeah,
well,
for sure.
Well, I think that's since we're out of time, that's a good place to wrap. Tim, any you want to leave any final thoughts here? I'll give you the platform for 30 seconds.
No, I just think I think this is where things get interesting, and when you start to see there's like, hey, one weird trick to solve all these things, I think that's probably not true. It's like identifying where these really meaty parts are, and that's still going to be difficult. But again, I think it's getting to that as fast as you can, knowing what you can do about it, or knowing you need to quarantine it off. Again, I think it's like that mix or that little spot is really where folks tend to struggle for all sorts of reasons, and I think that's there's not necessarily a silver bullet for that. So there's all sorts of things that show some promise to feed that information in there, but it's got a way to go. But I think that's the right path.
All right, we'll cut it there. I feel like I don't feel any better about this than when we started, Tim. You were supposed to make me feel better about this, and I don't feel any better about it. I continue to worry about the mountains of tech debt that we pile. And James, what you were talking about, just the stuff that's out there for a year, 6 months, 2 years, doesn't get updated. Suddenly, like, oh crap, the upgrade path isn't an upgrade; it's a rebuild.
I love your optimism of a year or 2 years. I mean, I'm talking about stuff that's been out there for 10, 12, 15 years.
Yeah,
now all of a sudden, we're like, oh man, how do we get to this? Yeah, I mean, it's
who has access? Does anybody have the source code to this?
Yeah,
there's that
we had an
too.
issue where the only person who worked on it retired like 10 years ago. Right. So like they didn't even have anybody to fix it. It's crazy. I mean, for what it's worth, when we started this whole Kusari journey, it's like when people actually show you for real what they're dealing with, like it's amazing.
How much alcohol do you have in the office is what I want to know.
More, well, probably not enough after the last couple of days. And everyone struggles with this though. Like, it really is a common problem. It's not like it's not only some people. Everybody we're seeing has the same thing.
Yeah, and we touched just a small surface. I mean, Tim, you mentioned earlier, like the licensing things to think about. the idea, we didn't even cover the idea that, hey, what happens when that component just gets pulled from the package manager, right? That was my reference to the left function, right? Like somebody goes and pulls and they're like, hey, I got this left function that every package in the world uses. Somebody ticks me off, I'm yanking it. And every component in your system is now dead in the water. Like that, it's not just vulnerabilities that we have to worry about when we think about that supply chain side. I mean, it's what if that package goes away? What if they stop maintaining it? What if all those things become a huge problem? And, most organizations don't give any thought to what would I do if this stopped being updated, right? So,
yeah, like we started using Nix for a while to try to solve that problem. So you have the entire, the entire tree of everything that you're using. But the technical barriers of having an entire dev team built on Nix was too high. And so this didn't work. So we've been trying to take like the principles that make that work, extract them and use that as the approach. But it's hard. Like I'm telling you, like most folks do this with paperwork and it just doesn't work, but it's just a CYA exercise at that point. It's like, who can I blame?
Yep.
I'm going to tell you guys, I'm going to leave it at this. We were talking about this beforehand and I finally found it. There's an XKCD comic. It's called Dependency and it's 2347 if you want to go to xkcd.com/2347. And it's called Dependency. And it's all modern software infrastructure. It's got this huge stack of things. And it's got an arrow pointing to this like one tiny peg on the very bottom. This is a project some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. And heaven help us when that person finds a new job, decides that they want to retire, gets hit by a water buffalo crossing the street, something, right? The entire world stops moving. And anyway, on that cheerful note, thanks for joining us, Tim. This has been fun, if maybe a little depressing. But it is too early in the morning. It's not noon yet here, so it's too early in the morning to drink about it. But yeah, we'll coffee it out and see what happens.
No, thanks for having me, guys. This is a fun discussion. Love to have more sometime.
All right, maybe we'll follow up on this.
Appreciate it.
Although I need some lag time to get undepressed from this.
Awesome.
James, thanks for joining, boys. It's been fun.
Always fun.
James,
Absolutely.
Thanks for the insight. And folks, thank you for listening. This has been another episode of your favorite cybersecurity podcast, the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Share with your friends. Put it on your parents' playlist. I don't care. I just want better distribution. I want everybody else to hear this. Introduce this. This episode would be a great one to introduce to your developers because it might inspire something, if nothing else than fear, and maybe a little loathing. And so as we close this out, I want to thank you guys for listening. We'll see you another time, another place on another